Welcome once again to Dialogue on Public Issues. This is John Chowning with Campbellsville University. I'm honored today to be interviewing Dr. Bill Wilson. Dr. Wilson is the director of the Center for Healthy Churches, located and headquartered at Belmont University. Dr. Wilson, welcome to Campbellsville.
Thank you, John. It's good to be here.
We appreciate your taking time to sit down for this interview. Tell us a little bit about yourself. You have some strong Kentucky roots, I believe.
I do. I was born my dad was a seminary student at Southern Seminary, and then came back eventually and finished college at Murray State University. And then I went to Southern Seminary and started our family there as well, and have family members in Kentucky today, but live in Winston-Salem. And the center, while it's based in a couple of different locations, is really a virtual entity. After 33 years of being a pastor or on staff at churches, 10 years ago I sort of took early retirement from that and have been leading some form of almost a consulting or coaching group for congregations around the country. It's been a great experience.
Yeah. Before we delve into the mission of the center, I might note you know and have had some contact with our former president that many of our viewers know and love, Dr. Ken Winters.
When I was a student at Murray State, I started dating a local girl and went to her church. Ended up being the part-time youth minister at First Baptist in Murray, and Ken and Shirley Winters were a part of that congregation and good friends with my mother and father-in-law, future mother and father-in-law. And through the years, I've appreciated Dr. Winters and his political life and academic life, and been a friend to my family and to me since then.
They're still going strong, both of them. They
word.
were here not long ago. Share with us about the purpose and the mission of the center. You mentioned that it was not so much a physical location as it is a virtual location, and the mission is external in nature.
So our intent is to work with congregations and clergy of every stripe and flavor. We call ourselves a trans-denominational entity, to get, stay, and be healthy. And that's a big chore these days for clergy and for congregations or faith communities or parishes. We have found over and over that some of the crises in congregational life in the 21st century in America are rooted in a dysfunctional, unhealthy model of doing church. So the intent is to create a good virus, if you will, to counteract some of the negativity and the things that have made for ill health by providing some new ways of doing things that are healthier and more likely to produce a thriving congregation.
And what are some of those dysfunctions or some of those issues that have contributed to a lack of health in the 21st century church?
Well, that would take the rest of the week on the show to talk about the headwinds the church faces. Every piece of data out there suggests that the era of the church culture is over. We are certainly in an era, and it seems to be accelerating, where congregational engagement with people in the larger community is declining. Faith in general, in terms of a public part of people's expression of life with a faith community, is on a sharp decline. Congregations of every stripe and flavor are finding themselves heavily populated with senior adults who are their primary donor pool, and that means some say 1 in 4, some say 1 in 3 congregations in the next 10 to 15 years will be not viable financially. The rise of the megachurch has actually accelerated that, as megachurches that have found themselves growing by virtue of transfer growth from established churches. So it's a bit of a cannibalization of congregations. Number of students going to seminary is in sharp decline. We could go on and on. You've got aging facilities that were built for the post-World War II era that no longer really are needed. We have a lot of congregations that have more building than people, and the upkeep of that and the maintenance of those facilities can become a severe financial drain. So those are the negative just a tip of a big iceberg. What we say about healthy churches is
Right.
they really are founded, first of all, by people who want to be Christ followers, which in and of itself suggests there are some other things to follow that are not as good. So we would say healthy churches, as opposed to unhealthy churches, do keep a primary focus on the kingdom, the lordship of Christ, not the lordship of the pastor or denomination or doctrine even. So Christ followers who have a shared vision. That's our second component. Many congregations in the midst of challenges or headwinds fracture and go in lots of directions. Right. So a shared missional vision, that there's something that holds us together, that's a very critical component. In a trusted culture, so a culture that thinks the best of one another and practices the things Jesus taught his disciples about caring for each other, trusted culture. If those components are there, then the fourth component, with a thriving ministry, may not mean, radical growth numerically, but it does mean meaningful, thriving ministry, where people feel like what we're doing here makes a difference, and we're not just playing church. So if you think about the corollary of those would be, we're not following Christ, we have a low trust culture, we don't have a shared vision, and the things we do tend to be dead on arrival. Well, that's the dysfunctional church we often are called to come try to help. So it's not an easy day to be a church. But I will say, John, I can make that speech, and then I can also say with a straight face and with a lot of energy and passion, there's never been a better day to be a church. There's never been a day where the gospel was more needed and the needs of our culture met by what we know to be the truth. So I can be a bit of a oh no kind of person, but I can also be a real oh boy. Now, it doesn't mean doing the same thing and expecting different results. It means looking at the context and thinking, how might we adapt the mission to fit the 21st century? And that's the challenge, of course.
What is the appeal of the megachurch in our culture?
So the megachurch, and I worked with megachurches, and the church that I grew up in, my father founded. I think we have 12,000 members now in 9 locations, and so I appreciate them. The studies that have been done, there's a wonderful study from Leadership Network and Hartford Seminary called Not Who You Think They Are, that affirms some of the very best parts of the megachurch, but generally, megachurches exist by lateral growth from other congregations. 74% of the people in megachurches came from another church. 20% are biological offspring. So that means 95-ish% are there from other churches or biological offspring. So generally what people will cite are the quality, the caliber of worship. It's less seemingly tied to another era and more focused on today. The sense of movement, that this church is going somewhere rather than going in circles, oftentimes led by very charismatic and engaging pulpit folk, both music and spoken word. And a lot of the vestiges of tradition have been laid aside for the expediency of today, and that's appealing to people who don't have a suit to wear, don't have a sense of the nomenclature they need to know to go into a congregational setting. And the bottom line is, it feels like something's happening there, and so many of the lateral or transfer growth, or they call it upgrade growth, that's another word for it, because we have a youth group of 6, and they've got a youth group of 50 or 100 or 600. That feels like a nice upgrade to, comfort class or whatever. It all feels higher quality and more engaging. It also is not nearly as demanding.
Right.
You don't get to be on a committee at a megachurch. You don't have to be on a committee.
Right.
Nobody's going to ask you to volunteer to do much except come to worship, maybe be in a small group or a life group, and be engaged in that. And with our lifestyles, that can be very appealing.
Are we seeing the decline? There's a lot of talk of post-denominational era. Is that real?
Absolutely.
Or is it just a transition to another
right.
name or categorization of affiliations?
If you survey 10 church starts in your community, I'll lay good money that very few of them have Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, Episcopalian. Usually, the denominational name carries more baggage than it does credit. If someone finds out I'm a Baptist pastor, I have a different conversation than not. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not. And most of the marketing studies being done by congregations find that one of the biggest disincentives for people to attend is that word, whether it be Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, and what people associate that word with, which often is judgmental, unyielding, condescending, or things that that's not us, but that's how they associate it. So in the end, what people are saying, in the same way that brand loyalty has gone away in terms of automobiles or appliances, we'll go where our spirits are being fed and where our children want to go in the morning, and it almost will make it work, whatever that sign says out front. And it's less about, I'm Methodist, only go to Methodist. I'm Lutheran, only go to Lutheran. It's, I'll go where I'm being fed. And so there is no question a de-emphasis on that name and a hyper-emphasis on relevancy and spiritual nourishment as a product that people get when they come.
For a number of decades, the decline in numbers were somewhat limited to so-called Protestant mainline denominations. We're now seeing more and more decline across the board.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, as Baptists, we always sort of snickered at the Episcopalians and the Lutherans and all that.
That's a bunch of liberals. The liberals are declining.
The West, the two coasts, there's several different academic pieces that are out there that would say it is pervasive.
Right.
And we certainly know that about Baptist life of every stripe and flavor. Institutional religion has seen its peak, and it doesn't matter if you're Roman Catholic or Assembly of God. What we're finding is every denominational body is facing a similar trajectory. Some of the exceptions would be the African American community and the ethnic community, where congregational life is still very much tied to identity.
Right.
So there is a kind of an insulation around those communities from this erosion in the larger culture. But generally what people are finding is less trust in institutions, period, certainly in churches, and our scandals don't help us.
Right.
And you may think that the Roman Catholic scandal doesn't affect Southern Baptists, but it does. The erosion of trust in clergy, the growth of the work week, so that 1/3 of Americans who work on Sunday. Well, okay, when do most churches do their work? It's a Sunday focus to this day. So the relevancy of Sundays being available, people being available, being accessible. When we start charting people's attendance patterns, the frequency of attendance figure is dramatically dropping.
Right.
Nobody gives perfect attendance pins anymore. You wear it, on your lapel, because we don't come 52 Sundays. And if you just take someone who was going a 50 Sunday kind of lifestyle to a 40 Sunday lifestyle, that's a lot of lumber in the sanctuary that you see on Sunday, so to speak. And actually what we're finding is people who were 3 Sunday a month will now be a 1.5 Sunday a month average, and think they're very active.
I was going to say the definition of an active member has declined, has changed dramatically in terms of attendance.
And it's not people staying home drinking coffee.
No.
I mean, when you start asking, where were you on the days you weren't here, they have homes in the beach, the mountains, whatever. They've got ailing parents who
Right.
in another era would not have survived, heart disease. Now they do, and I've got to go take care of them kind of thing. You've got, of course, athletics and weekend events, a lot of work, a lot of folks telling us, I come to Sunday as a family. It's the only day we even see each other. And by the way, our church is live stream, so we'll eat breakfast together and we'll watch it, and I feel like I've got my spiritual, blast. Now, I'm not in the sanctuary. The only metric we're measuring is how many people are sitting in this room in a 60-minute slot. Then your numbers are going down.
Yeah. So how do you go about, you and your team of consultants and coaches, go about coaching or advising or helping, encouraging that pastor or that congregation that is struggling with those realities of 21st century ministry? The pastor who feels discouraged, the pastor who may still have 20th century congregation who are lamenting the empty pews and declining resources, and the pastor struggling with the reality of all these issues and looking for ways to contend with that, and there's clamor among the members of the congregation who don't maybe understand the realities of the changing paradigm of doing church.
Right. Well, you hinted at some of those. One is you do have to help people understand we're not in Kansas anymore.
Right.
We have awakened in a new world.
This is even in the Bible Belt we're talking about.
Funny about that.
Absolutely.
Those stats, when you start looking at, people think, oh, that's just in Oregon.
No.
At most, we know statistically 20% of Americans will be in any church of any kind on a given Sunday, which means 80% of Americans are not in any kind of faith community. So part of what we try to do is, first of all, do a kind of a correction set to say it's not just you.
Right.
Churches tend to do a lot of scapegoating. Let's get us a new pastor, start a new service, a technical solution, we call it, to an adaptive challenge. And that usually doesn't work. It actually makes things worse, creates more instability. So we help them understand that this is not just, this is our cultural setting. So no longer can you think like a church that's going to expect people to show up on your door and you entertain them in a transactional model. You've got to start thinking, in effect, like a missionary. So if you were dropped into a different culture, how would you go about doing ministry? Well, you go to language school. You'd learn customs and habits, and you'd go out and meet the people. You'd engage them where they are. You wouldn't just say, hey, come to my little shack and hang out with me. And so retooling to live in a culture where people actually look at you with suspicion if you talk about being a believer, that's a very different mindset. It starts with us. So it's not pedaling harder and kind of hoping for something different. It's remembering, first of all, why are we here? Let's go back to Acts chapter 2. Let's spend some time, in 42 to 46, and it's not a bad place to start. What does it look like, the original blueprint of the church? Well, it didn't say you had to have an organ.
Right.
It didn't say stained glass windows were mandatory,
Right.
or that clergy had to be full-time benefited. It did say worship, discipleship, missions, community building, and evangelism. It said those 5 things. So can we reframe those, given your unique DNA as a church, your context? We do a past, present. Could you reimagine those 5 things in the future with imagination and creativity? Sometimes that works. Sadly, for some congregations, it's met with, well, if that's what we have to do, we're not interested. And not usually in that blunt a language, but they'll foot drag and basically let it kind of peter out. And so, there's a reason there's a big market right now in church properties in the real estate world. There are a lot available.
Right.
And mega churches are snapping them up and doing satellite locations, and others are dance studios. And the other night I was in Charlotte and ate in a restaurant, fine restaurant. I sat in the church balcony looking down on the Methodist church. The bar was right at the sanctuary, at the chapel, at the point where the pulpit normally would be. as good as the food was, I could not quit looking and thinking,
Right.
there was a day this was someone's spiritual home. And wonder what happened to get to this point. I think I know. But there are some other great stories of congregations that have said, we want to turn and pivot to the 2020 decade with energy, imagination, creativity, hanging on to what's valuable for us, but also scraping away the parts of us that are contextual for the season and can be rethought.
We've talked about a lot of the challenges in our few moments together, and there are many. And as we've both noted, these issues are real. It's not just the East Coast and the West Coast or the Northeast and Northwest. It's right here in Campbellsville. I call it Baptistville, USA, and where your home area you've grown up in, with a church on every corner, a Baptist church of every. If you don't like this Baptist church, go down the street and you'll find one of another, a slightly different style and so forth. The point I'm getting to, we've talked about the challenges. What are the opportunities in this context that we face and that we have, the resources we have that have not been apparent before in prior eras of history?
Right. Well, I do think institutional thinking thinks of resources as buildings and bank accounts, tangible, fungible things. I would say the opportunities for us are the spiritual but not religious crowd in our culture, fastest growing group in terms of respondents to questions about spiritual life, have a deep spirituality. They're very suspicious of institutional religious groups. So the opportunity is, how do you engage them on their turf? So the opportunities for many congregations look like a Monday to Saturday ministry, not simply a Sunday attractional ministry. So most churches are going to have to do both, but to beef up, how do we push out on mission into the lives of our people? So I've seen people there's a wonderful ministry out of New York City called the Center for Faith and Work, where you say to people, well, tell me about your work life. Well, I'm in corporate finance, or I'm an educator, I'm in healthcare. How does your faith engage you at work? And people say, well, it doesn't really. I just go to church and I go to work. What would it look like if we helped you integrate every aspect of your life, work life and faith life? Well, how do I do that? I'm not talking about wearing a tie pin or, I'm really making this part of who you are. So helping me make sense out of my whole life. Now, I may not ever show up on a Sunday morning. I may be an emergency room doc and I can't come on Sunday. But can you help me make sense out of my faith and my work? We can do that. And I think one of the things many congregations are finding is the old nickels and noses metric, only on Sunday. We start counting Sunday to Sunday. How many lives do we affect? And not just counting, but measuring. So how much hope do we give? The Center for Disease Control has just published a study that said they expect the #1 public health issue of 2030 to be loneliness. Well, we got that, John. We know about we have people who love each other through the hardest moments of life.
Exactly.
So the challenge is, how do you take our community building and push it out of the walls of the church? And there's some wonderful ways. When people begin to think, you don't have to come here to get what we do, we can bring what we do to you. Oh, that could be very interesting.
And while technology has issues, and we could spend days talking about the downside of technology, it also offers great hope and great resources to share the gospel and to minister. For all of its limitations, it does create community of some sort. One out of 3 people who marry in America met online. Well, just think about that. In the last 20 years, how that has changed. So why isn't our largest class at our church our online class? Whether it's people who are at the beach or in a nursing home or home with the flu or just home with their kids, why are we not engaging them in community? Granted, it's limited. And I usually say, look at universities, look at Campbellsville. How did they go from being a sleepy little
college with a a physical campus
Right.
to being this amazing, multifaceted learning center. Well, part of it is they figured out we're in the learning business,
Right.
not in the building business.
Right.
Well, we're in the gospel business, not the church building business. And that same transition is what the church is wrestling with. Universities actually have gotten there ahead of us. We can learn from them.
Right.
And there's some great lessons in how do you make education relevant to people who may never show up on your campus or only for a week, but still can learn, and you can make a big difference in their life.
We're in the closing minutes of our interview. Seems like we run out of time when we're on a subject of interest. Many of the people that will be watching and listening to the show attend small to medium-sized churches. What words of encouragement would you offer to those folks, to the members as well as any ministers who, because I think we in our culture have emphasized unduly that bigger is better.
Absolutely.
And therefore, by default, inferred that smaller is inferior.
Right.
Comment on that.
It's a great word. The average church in America on a given Sunday has something like 85 people present.
Right.
So the vast majority of churches, the vast majority of clergy in this country are in churches that are small, one kind of employee at most. What I would say is focus on what you do well, which is love God.
Right.
Let's do the two great commandments in the Great Commission. Love God, love your neighbor.
Right.
Both the ones in the house and the ones in the
Amen.
community, and make some disciples. Stick to that, and beware of quick fixes and the latest greatest book.
Exactly. We've exhausted ourselves with that. I
get
believe.
so tired.
Ministers and churches.
And I'm guilty, like
we
everybody.
all are. We all are.
But what works in Atlanta or Louisville or Charlotte or Dallas, that has almost nothing to do with what you're doing. And in the end, what we find in healthy churches of any size, basically people want to know, do you love God? Do you love each other? And do you love our city, our community? That's it.
Yeah.
And if you can answer yes to those and show me how you're doing it, I can almost promise you that if you'll treat each other with respect and the way that Christ taught us to, see how what they said about us, see how they love each other. You love each other, you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you love this neighborhood.
Right.
Not just the people that look like you.
Right.
Your church is going to be fine.
Yeah.
It's really not that hard.
Right. Dr. Bill Wilson, thank you so much.
Yes, sir.
God bless you, sir.
Thank you.
This is John Chowning with Dr. Bill Wilson, Director of the Center for Healthy Churches, thanking our audience for being with us for Dialogue on Public Issues. Thank you.